I'm the one who asked for the loot bags. And I was told that we don't have those, but we are going to have a reception afterwards where there's cookies and water. I also heard for the first time today that it's a not an us versus them scenario this afternoon, which is very disappointing to me because I'm going to have to rewrite my entire speech. And it was only a couple of days ago that I received a memo saying very explicitly that there's not supposed to be any police bashing here this afternoon. And when I got the memo for the police bashing, I'm a little bit surprised to see that it came from Vern White. But I don't plan on following any of those rules. For those of you who know me, that should be no surprise. It's happening in our streets, it's happening in our homes, it's on the road, and it's also happening when a person is in custody. The vast majority of police officers are doing an extremely difficult and challenging job, which most of us, including me, would not want to do. And they're doing this difficult job well. There is, however, a minority of police officers who are using excess force with citizens. They're applying handcuffs in a punitive fashion. They're unnecessarily using pepper spray. They're tasering. They're shooting pets. They're breaking bones, they're shooting people, they're ramming down doors, they're going into houses in unnecessarily large numbers with balaclavas on to intimidate, they're arresting individuals to remove them from the scene, detaining them overnight and then releasing them the next day without charge, and threatening anyone who questions their authority or tries to film their actions with obstruct police. And over the last 30 years, I've represented people who have suffered through all of those forms of police misconduct. The concern that I have, which is a concern for our community, is that because the existing forms of redress for police misconduct are so inadequate that police officers either subconsciously or consciously know that they can get away with this behavior with very little consequence, if any. The concern is that the lack of effective police accountability has permeated down to the men and women who are entrusted with extensive power. The result is that officers who are disposed towards misconduct and abuse of power, they know that they can get away with it, and they do it with impunity. More often than not, there are more police officers at the scene than there are fellow citizens. The police officers are more than willing to come to court a time and a half to back up their fellow officers' version of events. If the citizen is successful in establishing a breach of their constitutional rights, either that they were subject to excess force, or they were unreasonably searched, or they were arbitrarily detained, then they may be acquitted of the charges. But what happens to the police officer who's been found by a criminal court judge to have violated a person's constitutional rights? Absolutely nothing, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely nothing. You know that most times the police officer doesn't even know what the court's decision was. There's no system in place whatsoever to ensure that a police officer who has been found by a court to have violated constitutional rights is even told of that decision.
In the 1980s, Neil Nevitt wrote a book called The Decline of Deference, noticing that Canadian society had moved beyond accepting authority to wanting to be reassured about the proper exercise of authority. Indeed, I think we have moved from a society where respect was conferred to where respect has to be earned. And in my view, I think that's one of the issues that needs to be confronted head-on. Accountability should be welcomed. It should not be feared, it should not be despised, it should not be resisted. How do we move then from a regime of feared accountability to one where accountability is praised and welcomed? So there is resistance to accountability. I think Lawrence talked to some of the issues about the lack of ability to recognize and to impose proper accountability. I'll take a different tack and talk a little bit about our experience with the police complaint systems and some of the issues that arise all the time. It is obvious that there is some resistance to police accountability. Partly, I think it has been well known because there is a sense that the culture supports camaraderie, a culture that actually, where last night I was listening to Murdoch, where, you know, he said, he's one of us, you know. The idea that indeed there is a sense in which police officers want to protect each other. It's a difficult job, everybody agrees with this, and I think there may be a sense in which they ought to protect one another. There's also a question where in a hierarchical situation, it is difficult to bring about proper accountability. And as Lawrence mentioned, there's great power imbalance between the person who would complain and the person who would be the subject of a complaint.
We want to talk about what's happening with the Ottawa City Police Service, both in a positive way, raise some of the issues, and hopefully generate some discussion. First off, according to figures released by the Ottawa Police Services Board, a total of $85,671 was paid out in settlements against the Ottawa Police Service in the first 9 months of 2010. $486,500 in 2009 and $162,750 in 2008. Right now, with the current lawsuits, there are 6 that I'm aware of at the present time. That figure is in excess of $5.5 million. According to the Office of the Independent Police Review, 300 complaints have been lodged against the Ottawa Police Service since that office was officially opened in 2009. The statistics indicate that when compared to all police agencies in the province of Ontario, the Ottawa Police Service has the second highest number of officers being investigated for sexual assault on a per capita basis. In addition, they have the highest rate of criminal charges filed against officers on a per capita basis and the highest rate of investigations against sworn officers in the province of Ontario on a per capita basis. So the question we have to ask is whether all of these incidents are the isolated acts or are systemic or isolated acts of a minority of rogue officers. When you look at the number of complaints against the Ottawa City Police, you raise questions. When you look at the number of lawsuits, you raise questions. One problem is that Ottawa police officers are regularly, or have been up until the present time, until there were changes, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The fact a significant number of criminal cases are being compromised as a consequence should be of concern to all of us in the city. Take the Stacey Bonds case. Justice Lajoie stated that some officers in the Ottawa Police Service are either unaware or are simply not complying with judicial rulings by the Supreme Court of Canada governing strip searches. Recently, the Deputy Chief of the Ottawa Police Service said he saw nothing wrong in the video regarding the treatment of Roxanne Carr. He said he felt his officers acted professionally and in accordance with their training. The fact is, of course, Roxanne Carr, like Stacey Bonds, alleged that they were strip searched in the presence of male police officers. A second problem is that in the 5 lawsuits against the Ottawa Police Service, several officers stood around and watched the events unfold, and to the best of my knowledge, there have been no consequences for this. This despite the fact police are legally bound to serve and protect and prevent crime, even if it means protecting civilians from abuse by other officers.
That's because they're simply deemed to be too small or outside the scope of coverage. Of those 2,000 claims that come in a year, approximately 300 to 400 of them are dealing with criminal matters that I deal with in my division. There are 2 things about this. As I say to my students on day 1, if someone is showing up at a university clinic, the last thing that they really want to have done when faced with criminal charges is turned to a student lawyer. Even though, compared to some of my defense counsel colleagues, they're going to get better representation from their student lawyers. Present company accepted. There's no doubt they'll also pay a lot less too. But that brings up the second point about the people that come in. So there's 2 elements again. I guess they are the most disadvantaged members of society. So they are people that are new Canadians, members of First Nations, people of color, people with mental health issues. Every one of the clients is dealing with those. It also necessarily means they can only be charged with smaller crimes. If there's any risk of jail, they are going to get a legal aid certificate. And I just think that there's a huge linkage between civil liberties and the interaction with the police and poverty. Because you know what? Our grand charter rights don't mean a single thing if you can't enforce them at all, and if nobody is there to speak up for you with them. So what I see with my clients is a zone of risk. What I see is it's the clients that are most unable to enforce those rights or to do anything about them that are meeting with the members that society would otherwise least care about. Lawrence spoke about the cover your ass charges when someone questions the actions of the police. I also take a look at the charges that bring people into interaction with the police in many situations where it's not necessary. Darryl referred to the fact that the police, or some police officers, are systematically ignoring charter rights and getting away with it. We do see the traffic stops of people that are outside their car, the reliance on the Trespass to Property Act of people that are merely on a public sidewalk, the grounds to search someone supposedly because they're publicly intoxicated, when in fact they suffer from cerebral palsy.
A little bit about, we heard time and time again about accountability, and I want to begin by saying I welcome any accountability you can ask us to have. That would be a welcoming news for many boards in the province, not just myself. I sit on the Ontario Association in the past, and let me tell you, it's a challenge sometimes also to ask a ministry and to change the Police Service Act. So any accountability, but I like to hear about accountability, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to talk about specific cases because we told the moderator before we cannot speak about specific cases. So I'm going to avoid that, but I want to speak a little bit about the system we have in place today, and it's called the overview of the police oversight and role. It begins with the province of Ontario, the responsible for establishing the structure and rules for policing in Ontario through Police Service Act, including the rule that must be followed related to the handling of complaint officer discipline and termination. 2 on the list from the top to the bottom is the Minister of Community Safety and Correction Services, responsible for administrating the Police Service Act and monitoring police to ensure accurate and effective police services are provided, monitoring boards and police forces to ensure they comply with the respectful standard of services, developing programs to enhance professional police practice, standards and training, and conducting inspection of police services and boards. 3, the Special Investigating Unit is a civilian unit of the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Service, established by the province to investigate the circumstances of a serious injury and death that may result from criminal offenses committed by police officers.